We've boiled down the problem to you just don't know, or you're just not very good at what you do. And I think what we're leaving out of that discussion is time and money. A 40-year-old company that's printing money that dedicates 5% of its revenue to R&D for a shared IT team is not going to just turn the key one day and then create all of these product teams. They don't even sell a digital product. Yeah, they can learn from this. They can maybe experiment with some of the ideas, but the idea that everyone should be working how a bunch of like Web 1 and Web 2 and startups work in Silicon Valley is kind of part of the problem to begin with.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is a Reacts episode. Industry insiders having frank debates about the latest tech, politics, and business news. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into how current events connect to broader themes and trends that impact your startup, your investments, and your day-to-day operational decisions. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
And I'm Chris Saad.
And I'm John Cutler.
Today, we're thrilled to welcome John Cutler back to the show. John is one of the smartest and most nuanced thinkers in the world on the topic of product and product management, and his exposure to thousands of product organizations as product evangelist at Amplitude has given his thinking a level of nuance and empathy that is, to my mind, unrivaled. Most recently, John led product enablement at Toast, and his newsletter, The Beautiful Mess, is well worth a read. When we asked John to come back on TSP, we were thrilled that he said yes. John, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
In today's episode, we talked about the crisis and the angst that is affecting the product management community and founders and leaders as well, to say, what is the role of product management? Do I need product managers in my company? How do I manage them? And perhaps, do I have too many? This was a really interesting conversation. We didn't agree on everything, and there are some really spicy hot takes and also some very actionable advice for founders on how to build their product team, when is the right time to hire a product manager, and what sort of profile they should have. Stay tuned for all this and more. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. You might know that sinking feeling. You're about to land a big contract when they ask about compliance. SOC 2, ISO, PCI, Essential 8. You've just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Not anymore. Vanta massively accelerates your compliance efforts and allows you to get those life-changing deals back on track. Don't wait until it's panic stations, though. Get started with Vanta today. They're offering 20% off their prices just for TSP listeners. Do yourself a favor. Hit pause, go to vanta.com/TSP, that's VANTA.com, to get that 20% off. So, John, I've been following you for a while, and in the last few months, I've really seen a theme come out in your work around the state of product management and what it means to be good at product more generally. So I'd love to get your articulation of how you're thinking, and then we can dive into some of the themes there.
Yeah, absolutely. If I was to summarize some competing narratives, there's sort of one camp out there that is very, very passionate about describing ideal product management. And this resonates in a lot of environments because if you are at a company where things are crappy, in some ways, hearing about what great looks like both gives you personal hope, maybe, but it also gives you something to send to people at your company and says, we can up-level how we're working. It may even help your personal career because you think, wow, if I could figure out how to do that stuff, then maybe I could leave this dump of a company and go to a company that has it all figured out. And so that's one camp here, which is describing idealized product management or ideal product practices. The second camp, which I appreciate as well, is very, very focused on what we do at X or what we do at Y. And this is a lot of podcasts where you hear folks that have worked at certain companies. They share their journey at that company, what worked, what didn't, their leadership journey. Sometimes they drop some hot takes about what they did at that company that worked or didn't work. And that's also fascinating for folks, right? That feels very real. It feels like this is information you could use in your job. And then I think there's another group of people who are a little fed up about one or both of those particular narratives. So they are fed up about being told what idealized product management looks like. And meanwhile, in their company, it looks nothing like that. Second, there's people who are being told what idealized product management looks like, even at their company. And they look right in front of their face and say, it's nothing like that. You are portraying our company in a way that isn't anything like that. It's another group of people who might even be facing layoffs or facing things happening in their companies based on what all these folks are saying that you should do or shouldn't do. And so this is a very angst-ridden existential camp in this picture. So I don't know if it makes a huge difference in the grand scheme of things, but I think that ultimately for people who want to figure out product management, be a product manager, figure out where to work, figure out maybe where not to work, put their career in perspective, this narrative soup, I call it, is probably a bit disconcerting no matter where you sit in this whole mess of narratives at the moment.
So you're saying there's a first group that has these kind of philosophical or academic or generalized ideals.
Yep.
The second group is perhaps citing how their companies work as a kind of profit for the way it should work. But others in that company are saying, hey, that's not even real. And it's kind of like a false prophecy. We don't work that way. And the third group is saying, hey, you first two, this idealism and this philosophical purity doesn't exist where I work, and it's bullshit and it's just creating angst, and I don't see a path from here to there. Is that the three groups you're describing?
I'd say in that second group, I was trying to highlight how there are many detailed stories about how people are doing things in their companies. And I think that middle category sits on a relative high ground because who's to argue with someone telling their story of how they work at their company? It's a little bit more actionable and specific than these high-minded, principles-based approaches. And it's positive enough not to be too angst-ridden. So that's that middle category at the moment. And I think it probably bothers different people in different ways at different times, especially if you're trying to figure out product management at the moment.
Okay, so that feels like three different kinds of people. What's the debate between them?
Well, that's why I meant it's more of a narrative clash, I think. I think it is, like you mentioned, very much how people are interpreting this versus anyone's particular intent. So, for example, Marty Kagan, whom I respect a lot, is very passionate about describing how products should be done. And I feel like you need people like that to describe how something should be done. It's almost an eternal niche that you need filled with people. And in that second category, I think there's an eternal niche for people talking about how they did it at their particular companies. And then I think there's probably always some group of people who are a little bit fed up with both of those things comparing it to how it works. So I wouldn't call it a debate as much as I think it's people caught in this bit of a narrative soup at times. It's interesting because I think the startup community has always faced this in one way or another. I think that any profession that's a bit distanced from outcomes and has a fair amount of luck involved and a fair amount of network and, it's just basically hard and it's not very deterministic about what you're doing, always builds up a bit of a mythology. And then you have this counter group that says, in the real world of startups, nothing happens like this. It's all your teeth are falling out or whatever. And then you have this group that just loves telling the stories about their startups and how they worked out. And so I think that anytime you get a community or anytime you get a professional group of people together where outcomes are distanced from what you're trying to do, you tend to get this mix of things. An interesting example, let's go to the sales community for a second. Sales community doesn't mess around. They're not angst-ridden because they're going to close that quarter. Now, you do get a lot of gung-ho, pretty life hacky kind of theatrics, and you still have that little community that says closing deals is hard, and you still get that community saying you just got to have X or Y and Z, but it's a little less pronounced than I'd say in the product community, which probably makes it hard if you're a junior product manager or you're someone trying to figure out what to do and how to do it. Probably makes it a little bit harder than, let's say, if you're a junior salesperson. I think there's a fair amount of pretty darn good advice that you can just jump in and do it. So I think it's probably a feature of things like startups or product management or leadership in general.
Yeah. Let me tell you why I think this is not mere navel gazing, this whole narrative violation or whatnot. First of all, John, I think you're right that when you are doing work that has longer feedback cycles and feedback cycles that are noisier between your action and the result, it's much less clear whether what you're doing is working or not. You want to fall back on what might be called best practices because you can't just figure it out for yourself and know that it's working, right? So you look to the world and see this is how it's done. I think we're at a moment where, for example, Brian Chesky said, we're not having product managers anymore. And then Marty Kagan did his very well-publicized series of articles on product management theater and so on. And it's nearly like product management is having a little bit of a crisis of legitimacy. People who are not product managers often are like, well, what exactly do product managers do? And then the product managers themselves are like, am I doing a good job? What does a good job look like? And then if you read some of these books, again, I'll point to Marty just because he's the best known and I really respect his thinking. He calls it actually the best and the rest. And it's like, oh, okay, it feels to me like if this is how the best do it, I'm the rest. it's not going very well. Last time we had you on the show, actually, John, we talked about this, what you call the reverse Anna Karenina principle, right? Which is like every great company does things its own unique idiosyncratic way. And so trying to learn from how other companies do it can sometimes be discouraging because it's not how you do it. And also, if you try to do it their way, it somehow doesn't seem to work. Finally, you have all of these product managers and product people who are working in companies that do not run at all like these other organizations. And the product manager is simply unsure of what to do with any of the advice. Even if they try to implement the advice, it runs up against organizational inertia and simply that's not how it's done here. And so I think we have people who are unsure about their role. We have people around them who are unsure whether those people are adding value. And then everyone is looking to commentators and leaders for what is it that we're actually supposed to be doing here? And they just come away either confused or discouraged. I think that's really problematic.
Yeah, and I think that that's what I've been picking up on. It is very easy to make the navel-gazing critique, and probably the same thing with startups, right? There's probably people kind of getting inside of the whole meta narrative about startups, and you could really easily make that claim that that's a bit navel-gazing as well. I think, though, if you care about a profession, for example, like product management, it is a little concerning. You have people leaving product management completely. You have people being laid off in product management and thinking they might not ever get a job. You have people with 25 years of experience having a difficult time getting a job because the companies they work at are deemed to be not the right kind of companies. There's a VP of product recently, and she had just incredible experience across a number of banks. And I guarantee you this person could stakeholder manage the shit out of any company. Almost Jedi skills. And yet I have a feeling she's like, well, I guess that's just going to be early retirement for me. You know, no one wants a VP of product management anymore. Everyone wants a hands-on PM. Everyone wants a principal PM. That's the big thing now. You just get this really, really talented PM who's going to be hands-on. So it has real world implications for people out there trying to do it. And you can imagine someone trying to get into it and having a really, really hard time. I mean, I remember when I got into product management, you just generally needed to be a tech person or maybe have tried a startup or two. And suddenly people started to trust you to do this stuff and you called yourself a product manager. It was scrappy, but you just did it. And now I heard recently from someone that noted that their company had a MBA requirement for their interns, which just sort of blows my mind. So these things have real world implications. And to your point, I think they also discourage people. And I think that's the part about it which I pick up on, which I get a lot of people reaching out to me on LinkedIn and sharing their concerns or sometimes their fears or what's top of mind for them. And I have had an influx of people asking me, should I even be doing this? Or will my company ever possibly get better? Or can it ever be like one of these companies? And so it's definitely ramped up that level of fear, I think. And that's unfortunate.
So this is complicated for me. I have very complicated feelings about all of this, and I'm trying to find a way of neatly summarizing and articulating it all. The companies I encounter, I don't think they're having existential debates about what product management is so much as have a complete lack of understanding that it exists at all. They're not debating, is it this or is it that? They're more just like debating what is it and what role should it play. And their problem is typically not their product management, but actually their business culture, the whole culture of the entire company. Yeah. They have product managers. They've even sometimes called themselves product-led, but they couldn't be further from product-led. They're not product-led, but they call themselves product-led. And they think they can call themselves product-led because they have product managers or because maybe they have squads. Sometimes the squads aren't even cross-functional. They just have a product manager or two or three sitting over there, and you have a couple engineers and groups over there, and they call themselves product-led. The debate is so much more primitive than this. It's just so like, what is a product manager? Where do we stick them? What do we do with them? What is product led and what does a good product management process look like? And my job is to help non-Silicon Valley companies act more like Silicon Valley companies. I think the first problem here is that most companies, their whole culture, not their product management culture, their whole culture sucks. and needs to be restructured. Their strategy's too wide, their focus is too broad, their decision-making too sporadic and scattered. They have no process, much less a product-led process. They're stuck in endless loops of debate, then hedging. And then the second thing that strikes me is the reason it's difficult, and this is maybe more controversial for you guys, the reason it's difficult to come up with these generalized principles for product management is I've started to become increasingly convinced that product management is a lot like directing a film. And to me, that's not just a metaphor in terms of you're a director and you have a lot of craftspeople to guide. There is actually some good directors and bad directors. And you can go to film school and be taught how to direct the film, but only some people are going to be Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg. And that takes talent and judgment and taste. And I think that's a very unpopular opinion. And I don't care. I don't care. I think some people have, it's kind of like if you say, I want to be a basketballer and you're 5'2". Well, some people are born with height and some people are not. So there's things you're born with, and then there are things you can be taught. And so I think product management has more art to it and more talent to it than many of us are willing to admit or are comfortable admitting. And I know that's a very unpopular opinion as well.
I'm not sure it's unpopular as much as it bumps up against the reality of business. I think what we're seeing right now at a macro level is that the people who got into product management for the craft of product management, for the idea of doing things in a craftful way and showing that level of attention to detail, to be the Rick Rubin of their product team or something, or whoever, this kind of craftful idea of these things, they're bumping up against the harsh realities of how businesses are run and how businesses exist. And so at a high level, this is probably an issue of what world you're talking about. Startups are trying to survive, and you've got these massive companies doing whatever they're doing. And I think people are confused about these particular roles in the context of the environment. So I have a friend who's, a product manager at a shoe company. She has no questions about her role. She owns the P&L for a brand of shoes. She has no questions about who she comes to work with. It's talented designers and talented people who do logistics and get the shoes produced. There's none of this anxiety. And so I think that because product management probably does sit at the overlapping Venn diagrams of craft and maker culture and business culture, and then this sort of team leader role that you play, it's just inherently messy. And I think when the macro environment is pressured, it's probably just lighting that little spark under people and having them question about what they're doing and why they're doing it. That's what I walked away thinking from what you said. I think that a lot of PMs aspire to that level of craft and that level of judgment and that level of attention to detail and just doing it. I think the reality for many people in their organizations is a little different than that, as they're finding out. I think we have too many product managers, frankly. I don't think we need so many product managers. One of the key problems here is that we had in our mind that every team needs a product manager. And so you'll have a company with hundreds of product managers. So when Marty Kagan says, you can't have feature teams, you need to have real product managers. And a company has essentially 4 actual products that people in the world exchange money for, but just happens to have 1,000 teams. Is there really any geometric progression or physical truth that can exist that you can have so many product managers? And so I think that what we're seeing at the moment is this ethos of a PM with this little group of people doing these things, creates organizations with tons of PMs. There's only one way to advance in your career. It's either get into management or become a principal PM and move up in that. And it is a geometric war. There's only so many people who are going to get to those particular roles. And I think that that's part of the issue. I think that in many organizations, a good designer and a good engineering lead will be perfectly fine. You do not need a product manager. If you have a product leader for the product, setting a reasonable strategy and getting people aligned on what they need to do, you don't need product managers as much as some level of product management for all those particular things. And so I think the gold rush for all the salaries that PMs in theory could make just brought a lot of people into the business, and everyone wanted to be a GM basically, or be this sort of, senior principal PM. And I think realistically, we're going to find that we didn't need all those product managers, especially as designers and engineering leads get more product savvy, the amount of product savvy they need. So that's my belief. I don't know what's going to happen with that.
So 2 of the things you've said to me actually all go back to team structure. So you talked about there being hundreds of teams and PMs lined up against them. that's about the granularity by which you slice and dice your missions. And so if the company has over-sliced the missions, then you have too many little squads and too many PMs and too much granularity. And also you mentioned how all companies want now is these like principal product managers as individual contributors. And often what these companies need, and the company I described earlier needs, is a really, really great chief product officer, actually, to help them design squads with great missions that are not too large as they're boiling the ocean, not too small as they're confusing and granular, that they're able to turn the culture of the company over so that there is a very specific mission with a very specific strategy, with a very specific focus, where sales and marketing and engineering are not overwhelming the business in the wrong direction. They're able to fight for the right space to build the right things. And they're placing the right level of product manager in the right team, associates and standard product managers and senior product managers. So this, to me, again, comes down to org design. It comes down to leadership. It comes down to culture. Because no, I don't think you need hundreds and hundreds of teams with hundreds of product managers. I agree with you. But you do need great terrain mapped out of great squads with great missions, with great product managers who understand the boundary conditions of those missions and how to collaborate with each other and with their craftspeople, with their squad mates.
Can we just pause for a moment and reflect on how nuts this is? Chris, you were talking about companies that have hired product managers, but they don't even know what a product manager is. Like, what other role gets hired for based on, I don't know, like someone else told us we have to have product managers, but we don't even know how to use them, right? And so there is this like insanity to this. The correct way to hire is to say, we have a gap that we need filled. We need a person to take responsibility and accountability for this area. And we're going to hire somebody who is the right fit to take that responsibility and accountability and to do that work. And yet with product management, it seems to often go the other way around, where it's like, okay, let's start by hiring a product manager. And then, I don't know, because somebody told us that's what you need to do.
Well, just one second. This is not a product management phenomena. This is companies all around the world who have adopted Silicon Valley terminology and concepts without understanding what they actually mean. From Scrum to Agile to, squads and the Spotify model.
Yeah, I think this is where we're getting into trouble, if I was to sum it up, because no doubt many of these ideas percolated first in Silicon Valley. No doubt, so you had late 90s, mid 90s, the dot-com bust. Like, I made this timeline the other day of like Salesforce. I remember using Salesforce for the first time in 2001. And I remember the VP of sales coming in and saying, I'm using this weird product. I just logged in. I got our whole sales process set up and I want us to use it. And all the salespeople were sitting there with their spreadsheets and then sort of went back to work. And then he proceeded to get them all on this product called Salesforce at the time. I think what we're observing now, though, is the fundamental conditions for many of that first cycle of tech companies coming out of Silicon Valley and many of these ideas that we collected has certainly given us one model and a set of ideas about how to operate. So when Marty Kagan puts that out there, he's basically saying, stop telling me that you don't know who a product manager should do. I've written 3 books to explain that to you. The last one was a book to tell you how to move over to this model if you haven't done it. I'm telling you exactly how all these top companies are structured. I'm telling, as if the problem is just information. So we've boiled down the problem to you just don't know, or you're just not very good at what you do. And I think what we're leaving out of that discussion is time and money. A 40-year-old company that's printing money that dedicates 5% of its revenue to R&D for a shared IT team is not going to just turn the key one day and then create all of these product teams. They don't even sell a digital product. Yeah, they can learn from this. They can maybe experiment with some of the ideas. But the idea that everyone should be working how a bunch of like Web 1 and Web 2 and startups work in Silicon Valley is kind of part of the problem to begin with. And so I don't know, at any time you'll have companies at different stages of development and I don't know, they'll adopt what they can at those particular times. Like we could see it as be a couple decades before this whole cycle works its way through. I mean, a startup starting in 2024, that'd be another thing. To not know what product management is and not even have some places to start and know that you should hire a product manager. If you started a company in 2024, that would be rough. But otherwise, I don't know.
Yeah, I think this is about adapting or adopting these Silicon Valley ideas without understanding. Even if you've read all of Marty's books, right? You still actually don't viscerally understand. because you haven't been part of a company and a culture that lives and breathes this. I'll just give you a very selfish personal example. I never read a single one of these books. I just lived it in one company, and I deeply, deeply grokked it because of the visceral experience of it. And I think if you read all the books and never have lived in a company that acted this way, you're missing at least 50% of the picture, maybe 80% of the picture. And often what people do is they implement the behavior, they implement the words. Those are to the tip of the iceberg, and they don't implement all the stuff below the iceberg. And they're unable to, John, to your point, it's impossible for them to implement the rest of the iceberg because A, maybe their company doesn't need the rest of the iceberg and didn't need the entire iceberg at all. Or B, they're just in a place or in a culture or an industry or in a pattern of behavior where it's not implementable. The culture is wrong. The shared principles are wrong. The competence of the people are wrong. So you're dealing with people who, in Silicon Valley, these are typically young or at least typically eager to learn kind of people who are embracing the future, embracing chaos, they're embracing disruption, innovation. They want to change the way the world works. Change is part of their game. All the stuff we're talking about is a culture that embraces change, embraces experimentation, embraces iteration without understanding potentially where it's all going. That is not the culture of most people in most countries, in most companies in the world.
I don't think it's even the culture of Silicon Valley anymore, because frankly, those are the most stubborn companies I've heard of. That's where there's more rest invest than you could imagine. Those companies that are put on a pedestal, are they these like pinnacles of org design? Are these pinnacles of continuous improvement? Like in a lot of cases, actually, if you want a job where you can figure out a new way of working, don't go to Silicon Valley unless you're starting a company, because you're going to have a group of people telling you that there's no other possible way to do things. And so the number of people I see from Silicon Valley who imagine there's only one way to do something, I'm like, oh, have you ever been to Europe and talked with someone from a Scandinavian country? It's a little different, right? Like there's not just one way to run a particular company. And so I think that that's even the irony of this whole thing too, where it's almost Roman emperors sitting there and keeping talking about how great things are in Rome when maybe they're getting poisoned by the lead. I don't know. I think there's this other dynamic of it happening at the same time because there's not a lot of innovation from org design. So for example, I actually think you're going to see the most innovative aspects of org design come from China, Asia, parts of Northern Europe, and these are going to be massive companies at a scale of thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of people, and they're going to be figuring out new ways to work. And that will actually be a competitive advantage against Silicon Valley. I don't think people maybe admit that that could happen.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. The team at Vanta are passionate about helping you secure your business by vastly cutting down on the time to get compliant with frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and Essential 8. Vanta lets you close deals, sleep better at night, and get back to building your product. Help yourself and help the podcast by going to vanta.com/TSP for an exclusive 20% off deal.
It's interesting. I was just talking to someone yesterday where I was saying Silicon Valley innovates at the product and business model level, but it does not innovate at the startup factory level, where there is a kind of a very well-worn process of seed, Series A, Series B, biz dev, M&A, org design, and ways of working. I don't think that's an accident. I think they want to extract away the stuff that can be standardized and focus on the stuff that should be innovated on. And the way to organize the company is not, I think, a way to innovate necessarily. I'm a bit confused about why you say, like, look at Scandinavian companies or look at Chinese companies. There's innovation in org design there, maybe, but is there innovation in product and outcomes? Like, where are the top 10 most valuable and interesting companies in the world coming from? It's not from Scandinavia and China, right?
I think what I was mentioning about Scandinavia is just that, I'll use a very, very specific example. Someone from Silicon Valley will say, we don't need retrospectives. We don't need to do anything as a group here. Talk to your manager if you have a problem. It's the job of a manager to go deep, figure out your problems, and then keep you moving on your individual journey. And I was talking with someone earlier today, and they said, well, in a Scandinavian country, it's more acceptable, for example, for a group of people to talk about problems at the company and work through it. So it's more collectivist. It's like lower power distance into those particular things. That's what I was trying to get across there. But what my point is, I was just trying to pick places where you might see like a massive company like a IKEA or, I don't know, a Lego, or China has a number of massive companies that aren't doing terrible in this. And so I don't know where it will come out from, but at least from an international standpoint, trying to copy and paste what happened in Silicon Valley to different cultures across the world may not work.
Going back to Marty Kagan's thinking on product management theater, he said, a lot of people who call themselves product managers are actually really project managers, and they're not delivering the value of the sort of product management salary. So a lot of his advice goes to how can you deliver more value from your role? How can you be more like a product manager? But I was thinking about some of the things you were saying earlier, John and Chris, about you don't need hundreds of product managers in all these companies. There are too many product managers. So another way you can go with that same observation, which is that many people with a product management title are actually acting as project managers, is to accept that that is the reality of what is actually required at that company in that role. And, you may not like it. You may not like to call yourself a project manager. You may not want to accept that, this leads to lower earning potential and whatnot. But if that is what the company needs, if that is what the role is, then fighting against that reality, gnashing your teeth and having all this angst, that's not fun and it's not productive. And so I wonder if it's like, yes, if we have too many product managers, then the solution is to say, well, actually, project management is a really important aspect of this.
One of those companies that Marty Kagan points out has a ratio of technical program manager and program manager to engineer of something like 14 engineers, 1 program manager. And their job is to take care of all these messy details, all these messy things. Now, they don't call them product ops, right? Because that wouldn't be, we don't need those weird product ops people. They don't call them all these other things, but they literally can afford, because this company prints money, to have legions of people who are essentially managing the projects across these different teams to make sure that the whole thing is aligned.
Yeah.
And I just think that that's very funny to your point. Like, do we not want to admit that? And even Brian Chesky was amazing in that interview. He's like, well, I have this vision for product management. And he even pointed out, he's like, program managers, now that's a really, really, really important job, because they want to do things end to end, right? Like they want to be able to do things that are across the Airbnb ecosystem and kind of coordinate those things at the same time. So I'm kind of with you with that. I just think it's funny that people imagine these people don't exist. And then when you look at those actual companies, they've got massive L&D teams doing coaching to executives and managers. So there's your coaches. They have massive legions of program managers and can afford tons of them to make sure that all the work is coordinated. They have massive legions of finance people to make sure that none of your spreadsheets need to be filled out. They have legions of people just basically checking on the work that you're doing. So it seems a little disingenuous to like pretend that that doesn't exist in big tech. When it does exist.
I think you're right. But I think even more than that is a lot of people whose job title is product manager, they're actually acting as project manager, right? And that's often like when you go into Scrum and you talk about product owner, and a lot of that is just a sort of project management, backlog management, the so-called feature factory, where the product manager is the project manager. And that is painted as being a negative thing. And I think what I'm suggesting is perhaps depending on the company, depending on its circumstances, that's not a negative thing. If you don't need a product manager, like the worst thing to do is to try to actualize yourself into an unnecessary role, right? You're fighting against gravity. Why not just call it like it is?
And it's a good way to learn. Like I think that an org model you'll see in the future is as follows. 1 PM, 60 engineers, 20 designers, 3 product analysts, 1 UX researcher, 2 program managers, and then a sort of chief of staff to that product leader. So 60 to 1. You're going to see a 60 to 1 ratio with a sprinkling, like you need those UX researchers, you need great designers, you need that thing. There's going to be enough people helping with the nuts and bolts so that the teams, have the information they need. You're going to have analysts for that group of people dropping in when you need it. They're going to build up the infrastructure that you're going to have. And probably of those 60 people, 5 to 8 of those engineers and designers are going to focus on generally the systems for that group, the platform stuff that they're doing and developer experience and making sure everyone can move smoothly. So yeah, I think my guess is you're going to start to see these weird models that you haven't seen, which actually, Chris, goes to your point. That's basically a startup with 1 CPO and 60 engineers or, 20 designers and another 40 engineers. And then instead of the product hires that you think you needed for a 1 to 6 ratio, you use that to get UX research, program managers, analysts, and other people to help those teams. So I'm kind of agreeing with you, Chris, that like you could have the flattest of all models for a group of people, and that would be very effective. And yet I don't see that model anywhere for interesting reasons.
You just blew my mind.
Yay.
I mean, I don't know how that works. One very senior product manager for 60 engineers.
I actually think, Chris, that's sort of what you were advocating to John's point when you talk about the chief product officer. And
No, I'm advocating for a chief product officer who manages the entire business culture to make it really product led, who is a peer to the CMO, CRO, CTO, CEO, and can say to them, no, stop, change. We need a strategy. We need space. We need real squads. We need real timelines. We need to stop committing to contracts and obligations that we haven't got a roadmap to deliver for, and to culture and nurture a team of product managers. And in some cases, and I've played this role, to maybe even play a heavy, heavy hand in the roadmaps and in the strategies of those squads. But for that one product manager to then build the requirements and drive the consensus
That's
and the
what
craft
designers
people
are for. Designers are fine at that.
Designers.
You don't need a PM.
We had an episode recently where I kind of was a bit rude to a number of different functions, but like a salesperson never saw a deal they didn't want to close. An engineer didn't see a technical challenge they didn't want to solve from a blank sheet of paper. And a designer never saw a pixel they didn't want to clean up and make beautiful. None of those functions do what a product manager does. You need a product manager to be able to orchestrate the creative impulses of a designer, the technical impulses of an engineer, the sales impulses of a salesperson. All of those things need to be reined in and brought into balance with a product strategy. A designer does not and cannot do that. They can't.
I don't know. So many designers are pivoting to PM and back. Like, they obviously are capable of doing it. If you've done a couple cycles on a couple years in a product org, I think product managers are way too precious about the skills that they think they have. Do they really think that a designer is not going to pick up some of these coordination skills after doing this for 2, 3, 4
Great.
years?
I'm glad you brought that.
Not...
Let's talk about that.
Of course they can.
So I've written a blog post that talks about, the headline is Engineers Make Terrible Product Managers.
them's fighting words.
Could easily have been titled Designers Make Terrible Product Managers. And here's the point I try to make in the post, because it's deliberately incendiary title, is that a great designer, a senior designer, can be put into the role of product manager. A great engineer with product instincts and customer focus can be put into the role of product manager. But she or he cannot be asked to do both things on the same product at the same time. It requires a different headspace. It's like asking the camera operator to be the director or asking the lighting guy to be the director. It is a different vantage point on the film or on the project. And I was like saying this to another company I advise. If you put me in a sales meeting with a partner or a customer, as a product guy, proud, disciplined product guy, I will want to say yes to that customer. I will want to make that customer happy. I will say, hey, it's just software. Sure, we can do that feature. I will be pulled into committing to the things that that customer wants because it's human nature. But as a product manager, I need to have some emotional distance from that. I need to not attend all of those meetings. I need to not be in that position. I need to be the power outside of the room so I can balance that very human impulse. And so, no, I don't believe, John, that a great designer can be tasked with being both the designer and the product manager on the same product at the same time. I don't think that's possible.
I wonder if the two of you are not disagreeing as profoundly as Chris, you seem to think, which is it's not that having product leadership and strategic leadership on the product level is not important. But I think one of the things that John was getting to is about ratios. And let's talk about startups. We're the startup podcast. One of the things I see very often, and I've never actually had as good an answer as I would have liked, but I think I'm getting there, is really at the early to middle stages, who is the product leader? The CEO is the product leader. And the problem that I often see is they hire these junior product managers. But of course, I hear the frustration from both sides, right? The CEO is like, the junior product manager isn't doing what they're told. And the junior product manager is like, I'm doing all this user research and coming up with these great ideas. And then the CEO just tells me what to do. And the truth is, right, for quite a while, the CEO doesn't really want a product manager because they are the product leader. What they want is a project manager, someone to actually deliver this stuff, a designer to design it, but then ultimately the decision-making comes back to them. And so, this model, which I experienced at Google, it was definitely fully adopted this model where you have like one product manager to 4 engineers and that you have more product managers and product designers. The question is like, no one's questioning the value here, but I'm increasingly, John pilled on this, is like part of the problem is we have too many product managers. And where does the angst come from? Is it's like too much time to think about too narrow a space, too much ambition paired with not enough empowerment. And so are you better off having a small, top-heavy team of truly strategic product leaders who have purview over a number of teams where the engineers and the designers are actually responsible for the execution? I kind of think that makes sense.
It's also more of an apprentice model, which is, I think, what we miss in product management, which is an apprentice is someone who is working alongside someone who's really good at what they're doing. Yet, in most cases in a product management setting, you have your manager who's another product manager, but they aren't in the room with you. You might observe them doing strategy. You might observe the director in your one-to-ones, or you might observe them doing their thing. It might give you a little bit of feedback on what you're doing, but you're not sitting alongside them. So I think that one thing that stands out about what I was proposing, and I was, purposely said 60 people just to seem like a lot of people, is that if you boil down the other hats of product management, a little bit of that program management hat, a little bit of the product operations hat, a little bit of the analyst hat, those are things that provide you a meaningful skill that may develop into you being a product manager. Lately, people have asked me, should I start as a product manager? And I said, no, don't start as a product manager. We have no idea. I think there's too many product managers. Become a skilled designer, become a skilled engineer, become a skilled analyst, become great at customer success, become great service designer, get good at something and learn by doing, learn by being in the thick of it, and then decide if you want to advance in that thing. And then at a minimum, you have a really, really valuable skill that you can use. You can always fall back on being a designer if you don't like it, or you could fall back on that. And so I think what's happening is that we're just in this state of flux. And I think that this is the direction it's going to go. There will be more areas of specialization. There will be more areas of apprenticeship that you can learn alongside. So the difference in the model that I said is it is that lead PM's decision, the 1 PM for 60 people. They hold the decision rights. And it's not this game of telephone about like the junior PM makes the decision only to have their senior PM second guess them, only to have the director second guess them, only to have the head CPO second guess. Think how inefficient that is versus being in a situation where you're alongside that leader, learning from them as an apprentice while doing something. So I don't know what will happen, and I'm just giving one potential scenario here, but I think you could start seeing things like that. One other element of that is I think that the idea of these sort of 2 pizza teams, when you want to do something meaningful in a company, you will need that level of coordination to make really big and important things happen. And there's a great book called How Big Things Get Done, and they talk about building an airport in the UK. I think it was a terminal of Heathrow. And just how skilled they were at getting hundreds, if not thousands of people rolling in the same direction sort of made a tech company look weak in comparison. And so I think that these problems of scale, we haven't figured them out yet. Other than, saying 2 pizza teams, microservices, get 1,000 teams working together or break your company into different business units. We're still at the very beginning of that journey, I think. So I think that there's more to learn, like more we're going to figure out from doing that stuff.
Just to sort of carry this on, like for all our founders listening, I'd wonder what is the advice that you would actually give? We've spoken about this a lot from the product manager's point of view. I think that's important. But like I said, I think it's very common, partly because of received wisdom and partly because the founder becomes overloaded with work and they say, I need to hire a product manager. And like I said, I often find those conversations kind of confused because the founder doesn't really know what they mean when they say,
right,
I need to hire a product manager. So if you were to advise someone who's like, okay, I've reached that level of scale, I've got like 6 engineers, I hold the product vision, but I need help. What sort of help would you advise they get? Would you advise they hire a product manager? If so, at what level of seniority?
I'm going to be a little bit incendiary here.
Let's go.
And basically, first it starts again with the self-awareness to know whether you actually have any clue what you're doing as a product manager. So invite someone who knows product management and give them permission to completely grill you and interview you. Interview yourself for the CPO position.
As a founder.
So hire someone as a founder to give you an honest, legitimate CPO interview. Mm-hmm. And if you get through the interview, great, be the CPO. If you don't, you're going to have to find help. And have to find someone to help you, then hire that person. Now, if you do get through that particular interview, the next thing, hire a project manager. I'll say it, just a hot take. Hire a project manager, hire a UX researcher, hire a data analyst, hire someone that's going to help provide context for what you need. because you don't need product management at that point. You're a product leader in that case, right? There's product leadership and then product management. And so I think at that point, you need those other people to help. And so I think you could run a company up to dozens and dozens of people without needing dedicated product managers. And this is not just made up. I was doing an interview recently with a company and they said we're sub 50 people. They're like, we don't need any traditional product management. We have experienced designers, experienced engineers. We have strong connection with the customer. What I do need though is that I'm at risk of losing touch with customers and or getting too level set on our certain biggest customers. I need someone who's going to help me develop strategy because that's not my strong suit as we start to scale. And that was an interesting statement, right? Because he was basically admitting that no one in the company wanted traditional product managers. They wanted certain gaps to be filled that wasn't like, we need a PM for every 6 people in the particular company. The other thing I would tell the founder as well is don't start hiring PM of blank or PM of blank. Like, let's say you've got 60 people or 80 people or 40 people, and you start to imagine you've got these different product areas. You don't know what it's going to be like in 3 years. Just let people rove around a little bit. If you hire, director of blank and you decide that blank isn't something that you really need, you're going to get a lot of local optimization. Hire flexible generalist players that can move around the org where it's needed because the org chart will change. And you don't want them making suboptimal local decisions because they're the director of X and they want to build their team to 15 people. You want people who are committed to the single company vision, I would say.
Okay. Well, I think that clear, actionable advice for founders is a great place to end. I think this was a really broad and interesting conversation, scratched a few itches for me, and hopefully got everybody thinking, both founders and product managers, about what needs to be done to build that great product and ultimately that great business. So, John Cutler, thanks so much for coming once again on the Startup Podcast. I hope it won't be the last time.
Yeah.
If people want to find you online and get more of your thinking, where's the best place for them to go?
At the moment, it's LinkedIn. If you write a little note with a connection request and say that you heard this would be helpful for me to just filter through some of them, that's probably the best way at the moment. Or you could subscribe to my newsletter. I think replying to that gets straight to me.
And also, if folks just want to follow your thoughts, obviously, yes, you're a very prolific poster on LinkedIn. I have no idea how you produce the volume of original thought on LinkedIn that you do. So I'd strongly recommend that. Your newsletter, The Beautiful Mess. And also, I think you've just started a podcast also called The Beautiful Mess, if I understand correctly.
Yep. Working on learning how to do that. I have some background in audio engineering, but it's a lot harder to do than you think.
Yeah,
with all the remote stuff. Every day has new challenges. But yeah, I'm learning how to do the podcast flying under the radar at the moment.
All right. You heard it here first, folks. And Chris, where can people find you online?
You can find me at chrissard.com/newsletter. You can subscribe to my newsletter there, or all the social media at Chris Sard. And yeah, thanks for joining us, John. Been a fun discussion and debate.
My pleasure.
Okay, I need to talk to you all about the Startup Podcast Pact. We do ask for you, if you listen to this show and enjoy it, to please pay us back and pay it forward by leaving us a rating and review in your favorite podcast app, and also give us a shout out wherever it is that you have your audience. That really helps more people find us, allows us to keep putting out this show week after week, get the best guests, and continue to help you build a Silicon Valley style startup at scale. This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. With over 200 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools your business relies on. Head to vanta.com/TSP for 20% off their incredible offering and start unlocking extra revenue today. That was fun.